So let me guess, you just bought a brand new fancy digital SLR camera, you took it to your kid's hockey game, and your shots are all blurry or they're really, really dark. But hey, you paid extra for the telephoto lens. Oh, what's going on here? Well, if you haven't guessed, shooting in low light action shots are extremely challenging. You don't have a whole lot of light to work with, which you'd need a lot of light for higher shutter speeds. High speed action, so you're trying to stop that action with higher shutter speeds. You don't have any control over the lights. The lights are kind of what they are. And sometimes you're going to have to shoot through glass, and it makes very, very, very difficult shooting. But the good news is you got very consistent light. Usually my experiences as hockey rinks have been very, very well lit. And the ice reflects light very well. So it's like being in a big, giant light box. And of course, there's always lots of action, something going on in hockey. All right, so let's first talk a little bit about the camera equipment here. You're going to have a digital SLR. Point-and-shoot cameras just don't give you the control that you're going to need, namely control over the exposure program, whether it's manual, aperture priority, or shutter priority. You're also going to have control over white balance. Although I tend to shoot a lot in automatic white balance, but you might need to deviate from that. And of course, something with very, very fast low shutter lag times. I shoot a Canon 7D. It's a 59 millisecond shutter lag time, which is very, very fast. So by the time that I push the little button down, by the time the exposure is taken, a very short amount of period of time has passed. If you have a Nikon camera, don't fret. They make fine equipment as well. Just look at your owner's manual and see what your shutter lag times are. I can't give you a rule of thumb for what is too slow, although you can never have too fast. The other thing is the frames per second. My camera is about 8 frames per second, which sometimes I'll run it in a machine gun mode, which I call machine gun mode, rapid succession. Sometimes I don't. So that's the other things you're going to want to do is get a camera with a very fast frames per second. Lenses, this is probably the most important thing. Look at the front of your lens. And where you see that 1:1.4, if it says something 1, 3.5, or 5.6, or 4.5, that is your problem right when your shots are so dark. Your lens just isn't fast enough. And what I mean by fast lens is the diameter of the hole in the lens. It should be as large as you can possibly get. The lower the number, the larger the hole, the more light that goes in, faster shutter speed times, and all that kind of good stuff. These lenses aren't cheap though. Fast lenses. If you go to Best Buy or go to your just a local camera store, they're probably going to sell you consumer grade lenses, something around like a 75 to 300 4.5 to 5.6 lens for a few $100. You think it's a good deal. It just isn't going to be fast enough. It might be okay for outdoor daylight soccer or something like that, but indoor stuff you can forget it. You're just not going to be able to use it. As you, the little green light graph here is the zoom lenses, by the way. If you get down to something like a 70 to 200, 2.8, it's pretty expensive. It's about a $1,300 to $1,400 lens, but it's perfect focal length for hockey. 2.8 is the slowest you really want to get for indoor action sports photography. If you don't have a big budget, there's something called a prime lens. It's a fixed focal length lens. I've got a 100 millimeter 2.8, which is a little short for hockey, but it's a fixed length, so you're not going to be able to zoom in and zoom out and all that good stuff. But it was right around $600, and that's a fine alternative. A 50 millimeter 1.4, that's my other favorite lens. It's really not long enough for hockey if you're far away. But for about $300, the optical quality is excellent, and they're very, very fast lenses. I mean, they let a lot of light in, so depending on what your budget is, if you can afford a 70 to 200, that's the lens you really want to get. 2.8, of course. Also, you want to get a lens that's long enough just to tighten up your shot. I see a lot of people going out there with these 300 millimeter lenses because that's what came with their package, and they're trying to zoom way in on the hockey player's face and see if they can catch the facial expressions. You can forget it. That's just not going to happen. The action's way too fast. You're never going to be able to zoom in that close. My recommendations are get a shorter lens and get a larger area of the shot, a larger field of view, and then crop in software. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a few minutes here. Some camera settings, if you like to work in what I call the green mode or the program mode or the fully automatic mode, you're going to have to get your camera off of that. You're going to have to shoot in my 99% what I shoot in for sports is manual mode. You have to set your camera up. It's kind of a pain, but I'll show you how to do that in a second. Or AV mode. Let the camera figure out one of the variables, meaning aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. Manual is the best way to go. The metering mode, spot is the best if you're in AV mode, but it's irrelevant in manual. White balance, automatic white balance tends to work well in hockey rinks. At least for me, it does. And of course, ISO, you want to start low as you can get, but increase it. Depends on what your camera is capable of doing. You might get higher noise levels or that grainy, ugly effect when you're using higher ISOs. And of course, spot focusing. This is the most important thing here, is to get your camera off of that lead. Gee, let me make the decision on where the focal point is and figure it out from there. You want to control that and have the ultimate control of that. Spot focusing is really the only way to do that. So this graph right here is a relationship between aperture and shutter speed. Any camera will produce these things. The numbers are going to vary based on the lighting conditions. These are approximate what I get in a hockey rink. The curves that you see here are different ISO curves. So the top teal colored one is ISO 6400. And you can see it's a f2.8, the very bottom of the graph. If you follow that line all the way up, at 6400, I'll get about 1/4000th of a second, which is nice stop action type, probably too much, stop action shutter speed, but the noise is so high at 6400 that it's almost a throwaway shot. So basically, no matter where you are on any one of these curves, your exposure is going to be the exact same. The key here is the lower the ISO, the cleaner the shot. The higher the shutter speed, generally the more stop action that you're going to have. So what I've got here is the dark blue line that you see at the very bottom, the 200 millimeter. If you're using a 200 millimeter lens on a 1.6 crop factor camera, that's your minimum shutter speed. So basically the rule is 1 over the focal length times your crop factor. So if you're on a 200 millimeter lens, you're going to need a 1 over 320 second just to stop the effects of handshake. So what I'll do is I will sort of mentally build an envelope of my exposure range. So first thing is I'm on a 2.8 lens, so anything in the green could be valid. I'm on a 200 millimeter lens, so everything above that graph or that line is a valid exposure. And I don't really like to shoot anything above 3200 or even 6400, so that's my envelope of exposure right there. Now my camera does go up to 12,800, but I never shoot up there, it's just too noisy. So anywhere in this green area here is going to be a correctly exposed type of a shot. So how do I set my camera up? Generally, I will go to AV mode first. I'll set my camera to say 5.6. Just pick a number out of the air, and at ISO 3200. Pick a number out of the air. What does your shutter speed say, or what does your camera say it's going to be? In this particular example, it will be 1 over 500th of a second. I'll take a look at the exposure. I'll take a look at the action, and is it too blurry? Is it too grainy? So on and so forth. And I'll make an adjustment there. Generally, I'll drop down to perhaps f4 to get the shutter speed a little bit higher. Still at ISO 3200. Same exposure here. And I'll take a look at the shot. Is the stop action a little bit better? Is it grainy? So on and so forth. And I might realize that 60 or 3200 is just a bit too grainy. So I will drop my ISO down to, say, 1600. And that's going to require me to drop my aperture down to 2.8. And still at 1,000th of a second. And I might take a look at that, and it might be a little bit too stop action. I mean, the puck is frozen in the air. You really can't see any of the action that's going on. So I might drop my camera down to f4 at 1600 and 1/500th of a second. Same exposure, but just a slightly different effect where you're going to get a little bit more blur in your action shots. I'll play around with these values. This is before I see anybody, before the actual face-off. So when people are doing test shots or when they're out there, doing their introduction type things, this is where I'm setting my camera up and making very close, paying close attention to the shutter speed and the noise and so on and so forth. Once I let the camera figure out what the shutter speed is, I will dial all this stuff in manually. The reason being I go manual is there might be a certain part of the rink that's got a little bit higher light, or you might catch a little bit more of the background. If you let your camera figure all that out and take that into account, it may change your exposure and ruin the actual subject that you're trying to capture. So some examples of stop action. If you crank your shutter speed or you get your shutter speed too high, it's going to freeze everything. And this is a typical problem that I see with people doing action shots. They crank their shutter speed way up, and I know this isn't a hockey shot here, but the soccer ball is frozen, the hair is frozen, the shirts are frozen. It looks like everything was all painted in place. It looks freakish, actually. You want some kind of blur in there. However, if you have your shutter speed too low, the action on the hula hoop is just perfect. But the girl is starting to blur a little bit because the shutter speed is 1/30th of a second. That's just way too low. So generally, as I mentioned earlier, the minimum shutter speed that you need to counteract handshake is 1 divided by the focal length times the crop factor. My camera is a 1.6 body, and this is a 24 millimeter wide-angle lens times 1.6, and that gets you to a little bit above 1/30th, maybe 1/50th of a second. That's just to counteract the handshake. Now, it won't stop the girl, won't stop the hula hoop. It'll just keep my heartbeat, my breathing, and everything else from blurring the shot. I probably would have cranked this up to a little bit higher. I like the blur of the hula hoop, but everything else is just a little bit too blurry for my taste. You can see the goalie there is frozen, no pun intended. The hockey puck's got a little bit of a blur to it, probably not enough, but it's not bad. You can start to see the effects of the action there. This is probably at 1,000th of a second here, if I remember right. Same thing here. This is around 1,000th of a second. Everybody's frozen except for the hockey stick for that player doing the slap shot. And this is actually the right amount of blur. Maybe a little bit more could be better, but this is close enough for all practical purposes. Some people like to run in machine gun mode, and I see this all the time, is go out there and they'll just push the shutter speed, and they'll take 10 shots in a row, and they'll throw away the 9 that are hopefully good. I'm not a fan of that. I've been doing this for 35 years, and I've just learned how to time my shots. If I would have had machine gun mode on, I would have never got that joust bend as it was hitting that. I know this isn't hockey here as well, but this is one of those things that, it's my humble opinion, but just take your time and learn how to time your shots, and just don't let the camera guess at or let fate make the decision on when you're going to get the shot. Learn how to time it and get the puck going in the goal, or leaving the stick, or in this case the joust hitting the player. Focus point. This is probably the most important part about getting any kind of action shots. Whether you're shooting hockey or basketball or so on and so forth, you've got to use spot focusing. You can forget it if you're using anything else. What cameras will do in automatic mode is they will say, they will try to figure out what your focus point is. They'll get something in the foreground, something in the background, something to the left, maybe something to the right, I don't know, pick something, and it'll average all of those out. So you can imagine getting the focal point between the player in the foreground, the player in the background, maybe the background way off in the that little yellow band around the ice rink. Averages that, the focal point's going to be 10, 15 feet behind the players, and that's just bad. So you want to pick a focal point that is in a high contrast area. That's the other key thing, is cameras need contrast to focus. The challenge is what happens if you move your camera a little bit off, or the action's happening so fast and you focus, but you missed getting the jersey or the glove or whatever. Your shots are going to be extremely blurry because it's focusing on something now in the absolute background. So what I'll typically do is I will focus on something near the very bottom of the player, like their skate. And if I happen to move the camera off a little bit and I catch the back skate, at least I'm still catching something relatively close to the subject. And even if I move way far and I get the player in the back, I get their skate, I still have generally a pretty close point of focus. Now, if I were shooting like soccer or something, I'll definitely get the foot, because if I actually get the ground, which is generally contrast enough, you're going to get a right focus spot every time. It's hard to do that in hockey, because if you move it a little bit too far to the left, you're going to get the ice and the camera will never focus. So you have to play around a little bit on where your spot focus is. But key thing is you're going to have to use spot focus, and you're going to have to find a place. My opinion is near the very bottom of the player. That way, if you get it in the wrong spot, at least you're going to get one of their skates, or possibly the player in the back. Let's talk a little bit about depth of field. This is one of these mysterious concepts a lot of new people don't quite understand. There's a couple of things. There's one is the distance to the subject, and you're going to focus on them. And at the point of focus, there's a depth of field. The stuff that's going to be in focus in front, the foreground, or in back, the background. That's called the depth of field. It's a very, very narrow band of distance that you have to focus in. So if your players are sitting there, subject 1, subject 2, and subject 3, you focus on subject 1, they're going to be in focus, but subject 2 is starting to exit that depth of field. So part of them will be in focus, part of them will not be in focus. Also, this is not I call it a depth of field plane, actually, that little dotted line there. So anything on that dotted line is going to be in focus. Even subject 3 way off to the left, which is clearly a longer distance to the subject, is still going to be in focus. So if you ever want to test what this looks like, go outside and take a picture of a brick wall, focus on the center of it, and then in software, pixel peep the far corners. And if those are in focus, you've got a pretty good quality lens here. And this is actually a very, very good quality lens that I'm taking this test with you. This is the infamous brick wall test that people use to test quality of lenses. So that's the same thing. This is the wall is actually your focal or your depth of field plane, as I call it. Now, so what happens is your subject's going to be skating around. And you've got subject 1 that's moving to, say, the left and maybe getting a little bit closer, and you're sitting in one spot and you're rotating your camera around to kind of track them. And so your distance of the subject is still the same. This means if you keep your finger halfway pressed down, locking the exposure program in the focal distance. If you don't have it pressed down, your camera's going to have to refocus it. But this is just assuming that you got your finger pressed halfway down, you've locked in on subject 1 in the first position, skating off to the left, and you're rotating it carefully to kind of track that subject 1. Notice your depth of field plane is always going to be normal to your camera or perpendicular to your camera, and that depth of field doesn't change. So now subject 2 is now perhaps in the foreground. He's going to be blurry. Subject 3 is way out of that depth of field, so he'll be blurry, but at least subject 1 will be in in focus. So if your subject or your subjects are going sort of kind of off to the left or off to the right, and you focused on subject 1 and they're skating off to the left, and you rotate to see them, and they're now out of your field of view, or your depth of field, I should say, nobody's going to be in focus here. So if they're going too far away from you, you're going to have to instantaneously take your finger off the shutter, push it halfway down, and then shoot on subject 1. It's going to let the camera refocus. This is one of the reasons why you're going to have a camera that's got a very low shutter lag time and a very fast level of focus, so you can dial in on those guys, those players off a lot quicker. So the key thing is when they're moving away from you, it's very, very hard to get that focus, get the focus on the players, because they're sort of moving away from the distance the subject is growing. If your players are coming directly towards you, and this is the majority of what you're going to run into in sports photography, is within a split second they're out of that depth of field. They're coming right at you. It's not like you have the angle effect where, if they go off to the left or the right, you've got a little bit of leeway there. If they're coming directly towards you, within a split second, they're already out of your depth of field. This is why you need a camera with a low shutter lag time. So if you focus on them at the very top of the image there, the subject 1, by the time that you push the shutter all the way down, that's your shutter lag time. So by the time the subject 1 is, in the lower, the red circle, that's when the picture is actually taken. They're already out of your depth of field. The faster you have a camera, the quicker you're going to get them in of that depth of field. So if your shots are blurry, that's probably a reason why, is either your camera is just too slow, which it may not be the case, but it's just the technique on shooting. If they're coming at you, you're never going to get them in focus. Not even the professionals will try to get that. If they do, it's going to be probably more luck than anything else. And if they're moving sort of to the left or the right, you've got a pretty good chance. If they're kind of moving around you, your point of view, you're probably going to have a much better chance of getting them in focus. So if you're wondering how big that depth of field is, this graph here tells the story. So this is a value for a 200 millimeter lens, and you can see at f2.8 is the blue curve and f4 is the red curve. So if you're, say, 40 feet away from your subject, which is pretty realistic, and you're shooting, say, f4, which is pretty good, Still relatively fast, but it's going to give you some good light there. Your depth of field is 2 feet. That means if your subject is 40 feet away, stuff 39 feet to stuff 41 feet is going to be in focus. Anything else will be out of focus. And even at the fringes of that 39 to 41 feet, the boundaries are going to be a little bit blurry as well. So 2 feet is not a whole lot. That's not even the width of a hockey player. And if they're moving, they're going to be out of 2 feet in just a split second. So if you're shooting at f2.8, wide open on my lens here, I've got about a depth of field of about 13, 15 inches. 15 inches is nothing. It's not even the width of a glove for some players. So this is the hard thing about photography is you have such a narrow depth of field to shoot in, and they're moving so fast. Getting them in focus is extremely difficult to do. You're going to have to practice and practice a lot. Now, ideally, you'd want to shoot at something like f8 or f11. It's going to give you a much, much wider depth of field, but you don't have enough light. That's the problem with indoor sports photography. So let's change focus a little bit here, no pun intended, to shooting locations. Where do you want to get your tickets when you're buying them? Right at the center of the rink, the 50-yard line in a football game. It's actually the worst place to set up for shooting. You're too far from the goal, too far from where the players typically like to shoot at, somewhere in the 25% of the ring mark. Where I like to sit is right here at the 25% ring mark, or even better, in the cheap seats right behind the goal, off at some kind of an angle. That way when somebody's coming up for a shot, you can see them and the actual goal. And this is me at the 25, I call it the 25% mark of the rink, but I can see the player lining up for a shot, the goal in the background, just waiting for it. This is one of my favorite places to shoot at. It's kind of my signature shot there. This is what you're probably going to end up with a lot of times. You're going to be way up in the stands. You're going to be shooting down on people, and it just makes them look smaller than life. This is kind of the birthday party shot here, where the parent is standing up, the kid's blowing the candles out, they're shooting down at them. What do you see? You see the top of Junior's head. Terrible. Bend down. Get down at the eye level. It's hard to do in hockey because you're going to be shooting through glass, or you might not even be able to get up to the glass because of rules of the sport and whatnot. So another thing I like to do is don't wait for just the slap shot to take a picture of. While this is one of my favorite shots here. This is a practice game. That's why the uniforms are kind of all over the map here. But you can see the shots in the air. Does the goalie get it or not? You don't know. It's kind of the story being told is, it's kind of the excitement of the game. Also, other things to get is the face-off. This is another one thing that I like to get is, before the game or before the action starts, get one of these kinds of shots, even getting the puck going into the goal. Now, this was a practice game. That's why there's so many pucks in the back. But you get the idea that it's not just a slap shot that's the winning shot. Also, after the goalie stops the puck, him looking back saying, "Hey, buddy, is that all you got?" This is another one of my favorite shots to capture. Framing, this is another important concept that you might not be able to do good framing during photography or during shooting. You might have to get this adjust this in software. What do you want me to look at here? Do you want me to look at number 22 shooting the shot, the goalie trying to defend that shot, or the guy off on the left? I don't know what he's doing here. It's a very, very busy shot. If you can't crop it in your camera while you're shooting, crop it in software. Just zoom in a little bit. And of course, I've lightened this up a little bit as well. Now there's two people there. I know exactly what I'm looking at. I think the shot's going to go in, but I don't. This is kind of the story you're telling here. And you do this with just focusing the user's eyes on what you want them to shoot. Here's also the a concept of the depth of field that we talked about earlier. Who's in focus? The goal. The puck is blurry because it's so fast moving, but 22 is out of focus because of that depth of field that we saw. Now, what do you want to be the important thing? Do you want the goalie to be in focus, or the player shooting the shot to be in focus? I just chose the goalie because it's somebody I know and I want to get the shot for them. But you could easily have shot or set your focus on the person shooting it, and it would be a little bit of a different story. Another common thing that I see people doing is they'll line the player right up in the center of the frame, and they'll take the shot and think that that's a winner. I know they're going to the left, but it doesn't really. The shot just doesn't give them a lot of places to go. So there's a very common thing in photography called the rule of thirds. Mentally divide your camera up into three zones, horizontally and vertically. put your subject on one of those third lines. Now it's a little bit better of a story being told here. He's going to the left, and you can clearly see that. It just gives him some room to maneuver here. It just feels a little bit more natural. Some tips in post-production here. Here's the before in the lower left and the after. I know I showed this a few seconds ago, but not only did I crop it in, but I lightened up the image and alter the contrast just a little bit. It's very difficult to get a perfectly exposed shot out of your camera, especially in indoor sports photography. You're probably going to have to do some level of post-production. There's tons of YouTube videos out there on how to lighten shots and adjust contrast. Fish around for the one that works best for you. Getting started, don't wait until the next hockey game to start practicing your skills. If you're going out to dinner tonight, take your camera. Start practicing in a low light environment. At the mall, another perfect place to do that where you don't have a whole lot of light to deal with. Walk around the neighborhood at dusk and take pictures of cars moving by or whatever. Just get used to working in manual mode. If you're not used to it, it's going to take a while for you to figure out how to get your camera working. But once you have, you're going to watch your level of photography go way up. And of course, the spot focusing is the other thing that you need to practice on, and take tons and tons of test shots. And you're never going to get shots good out of the camera the first time, so be patient. It's going to take you a while to get used to working in manual mode and taking action shots, especially when you don't have a lot of light involved. And the other thing is, if you don't have a fast lens, a 2.8 or faster means a 2.8 or a lower number. You're going to have to spend some money and opt for one. So anyway, folks, I hope you learned something here. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to comment.